Hi, everyone. Good evening. Welcome to Evoke Therapy Program's broadcast. Today is Thursday, April 1st, 2021. Tonight, like we announced, we have a very special broadcast this evening. We're actually going to do a panel discussion, and we have been blessed to have wonderful experts in this field. We're going to be talking tonight about parenting third culture kids, and this is going to be a roundtable discussion. We have some questions that we've come up with ahead of time, but you could submit questions or comments at any time during the broadcast, and Cassidy, who's moderating for us this evening, will pass those along when it's time. But before we get to those questions, I'm going to give a couple of brief pieces of housekeeping introductions. The first thing that I want to say is this is not a wilderness therapy focused broadcast this evening. So if you're listening to Evoke Therapy podcasts on a regular basis, this is a little bit of a departure from that. And the experts aren't coming on to advocate or endorse Evoke or wilderness therapy. They're coming on with their expertise in third culture kids. And so that's the focus of tonight's broadcast. We'll try to make application to the parents that are attending live. So if you have questions, we'll try to find that connection to the work that you all are doing as you're working through wilderness therapy. So I'm going to do my best to introduce this prestigious panel. I'll start off with Ruth Van Reken. Ruth is known internationally for her lifetime of work with third culture kids, having grown up as a TCK herself as an American in Nigeria. It took her years to fully process what that experience meant in her life, and eventually published her own memoirs that reveal her own struggle with depression in Letters Never Sent. In 1999, she co-authored with David C. Pollock one of the most important books ever written about gonna have a problem with that this evening. Probably should have practiced that a bunch. TCKs, Third Culture Kids, Growing Up Among Worlds, which is now in its third edition. She's an icon in the field and has spoken to international schools and other organizational audiences around the world about her passion for understanding third culture kids. Her invaluable insights are the result of having worked with this population for decades. So welcome, and thank you for coming, Ruth.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here.
Dr. Anisha Abraham. Dr. Abraham is a pediatrician, teen health specialist, public health researcher, parent of 2 boys, and author of the book Raising Global Teens. Over the last 25 years, she has lived with her family and worked in the US, Asia, and Europe. Dr. Anisha's passion is helping cross-cultural teens to thrive. She has served in a number of roles, including being chief of adolescent medicine at a well-known teaching hospital, a lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Army, and medical director of a school health clinic. Dr. Anisha has been featured on several media outlets, including CNN's Headline News, The Washington Post, NPR, and the South China Morning Post. Her website is dranishaAbraham.com. So welcome, Dr. Anisha Abraham.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming. And my friend and colleague, Rebecca Grappo. Rebecca is an educational consultant who has spent her entire career working with third culture kids, having lived in 10 countries herself and parented 3 now adult TCKs. She is uniquely positioned to understand the stresses, challenges, and rewards of a global lifestyle. Rebecca uses these experiences and insights when working with students, families, and the therapists who work with them to help raise their awareness and understanding of the impact of being a TCK. She founded RNG, International Educational Consultants, 15 years ago and does therapeutic and boarding school placements as well as college advising. Her website is www.rnginternational.com. Welcome, Rebecca.
Thank you.
And Rebecca, do you go by, I call you Becky. Do you go by Becky?
Oh, please call me Becky. Yeah.
Becky.
Yeah.
Becky, I'm going to actually, I know I'm the host, so I probably should be taking a lead, but I'm going to turn some of this over to you. And this is the definition that you gave to us. So maybe I'll have you start with defining what a third culture kid is from the beginning.
Well, actually, I'm going to defer to Ruth for this because Ruth is the one who has written this book and has been published and republished multiple times. And so I kind of feel like she deserves the honors.
Okay.
Thanks, Becky. Thanks, Brad. Third culture kid, you can read it. This was the definition that Dave Pollock came up with. He was a co-author until his death and the gentleman who developed the third culture kid profile. But he said it's a person who spent a significant time of their childhood or their developmental years outside of a parent's culture. And although we build relationships to all of the cultures, I grew up in Nigeria, so there's a lot of Nigerian things I loved, and I'm from the States, so there's American things that I deal with. This is not a blending of two cultures. The original meaning came when Dr. Ruth Van, who was a sociologist, went to India to study how people from different cultures would do business together. And when she was there, she realized that people had come from one place. The people she was studying first were from the US. They were living in another place, which was the second culture. The first culture was their home culture. The second was where they came. But they had created a subculture, a space that was shared with others who were in that same experience. And so that's what the third culture is. And she called the kids who grew up that way third culture kids. The only thing Dr. Useem and Dave Pollock didn't do was to define that the kids that they studied were actually there because of a parent's career or job. And as the world has evolved, we'll start to see that that is an important thing because there's many ways kids are growing up cross-culturally in today's world. And so this is a specific way, but it's not the only way that kids grow up cross-culturally. So I think that in this particular experience, though, the thing that we also need to know is that in this, the thing that makes the hallmark of this experience that can be different from other types of experience is that because it's for a parent's job, the kids are having a very cross-cultural experience, and they can have, Becky said she'd been in 10 countries. Imagine how many cultures her children interacted with as they grew up. And every time they settled, they had a new one. And then there's the cross-cultural component, and then there's the high mobility, because Becky was moving, but also her community was moving because of this subculture of people that are having that shared experience. So we have high mobility and we have cross-cultural impact, and that's what we'll be discussing. What's the impact of those two things on a child's life during their developmental years? What happens to them?
Thank you. Dr. Abraham, do you want to add anything to that? Or should we get into the questions? Is there something you want to add?
No, I think Ruth summed it up very well. And I would just add that more and more young people are having this experience of having more than one culture in their life. And that's certainly something that I'm very interested in. And I'm certain that our audience is as well. And again, it's whether a parent has come to the country as an immigrant, they have moved from community to community or country to country, they're from different backgrounds, or their kids are exposed to another culture and their experience. We're just seeing more of this, and I think it's such an interesting group to explore and to understand. So I'm sure we'll have a lot more to discuss as we continue on.
Right.
I'll say one more thing too, that as Anisha said, the amount and the ways people do it can be different, but in any child's life, there are some children who have not only done it cross-culturally because of a parent's move, but their parents are from different cultures, so they have a double culture marriage, or they're from a minority interacting with a local community. So the issue of identity is becoming very complex for many kids.
I imagine. Becky, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to make the same point that Ruth just did, and that is that a lot of times these kids are not just, purely from one country, one culture, but their parents might represent multiple cultures, languages, religions. So if anything, I think Ruth has gone in the direction of calling these cross-cultural kids in many different ways, and that's a whole different presentation. But also, I think we could also think of these as megacultural kids, because they've got very often mixed heritage within the family, and then multiple moves where they've adopted and adapted various elements of the cultures in which they've lived. So really, the one place where they feel at home is where they find other people who have had a similar life experience, where you don't have to really explain what this is all about because it's normal in their world. So that creates problems when they transition, because explaining that sometimes is really hard to do. And a lot of times and the young people that I've worked with, it depends on how much they like you, how much they're going to reveal. If they like you a lot, they might tell you their story. If they're guarded, they'll just give you a very, very small sliver of the story and want to move on with the subject. They don't really want to get into it.
So we have a lot of questions that we can go over tonight. I think you guys have, and you can tell me if there's more to say about who are third culture kids. I think we've kind of introduced that a little bit so far. But the maybe the next question that comes out of that is, what would you describe as their main characteristics? You're going to have to decide. Maybe I'll go to Ruth first. I'll just go that way. We'll start with Ruth again.
Yeah.
The two things that come out of the cross-cultural high mobility aspect of this life experience are questions about identity. And then what I would see the biggest challenge is also unresolved grief. So if you can understand the story, when children are going through these many cultural changes and the rules change, in the old days when people were from one culture basically and everybody in the group was kind of the same, a kid learned the rules of how do we live here and how does life go here. When they were a child, they test them as an adolescent, which drives everybody crazy, but that's kind of what happened. And then they internalize them and they move ahead. When the rules keep changing, how do I figure out who I am? Because in the old way, I knew who I was. I knew where I belonged by the time I figured all that out. So the issues of where am I from and where do I belong are really big issues. And particularly it can be a challenge when they go back to their passport country and they look like everybody else. When I came back to the States when I was 13, I looked like the other kids in my school. It was pre-integration. So people expected me to be like them, but I had had a completely different experience. And so when that happens, kids often become either, they become a chameleon like I did. I tried to pretend I'd never been to Africa and just fit in. Or they can become a screamer, which is, okay, I know I'm not like you. I don't want to be like you. And parents are shocked. This kid who used to be kind of normal and everything else suddenly turns into this, like, who are you, child? Or some people were more like my sister. They just kind of withdraw and they're afraid to try because they don't want to make mistakes. And some kids seem to, go ahead. But identity is a huge issue because of the cross-cultural part. But the other piece, because of the mobility, and I know that Anisha does a lot of work, and so does Becky, is the mobility. Every time you move someplace, even if you're moving for the best reason in the world, you have a loss. You have a loss of what you knew then. And in this lifestyle, a lot of times we're moving for good reasons. And so people kind of try and play up the good reasons. But I was 39 before I understood that when I took an airplane ride at 13, my world died. I'd never understood the enormity of the loss because I knew that, I'm going to go see my grandma. Isn't this fun? So the whole issues of loss and grief, and most of the time, people don't recognize it because the losses are kind of hidden and they're not the ones people see. So I know that Becky and Anisha will talk a lot more about that, but those are the two big things. If we can help the kids deal with those challenges, then all the gifts that we'll also talk about can be used in great fullness. But those are the places where people get stuck and need some help, I think.
I mean, Dr. Abraham, it sounds like trauma. I mean, we don't think of moving cultures as a traumatic, I wouldn't have thought of it as a traumatic event, but when you're talking about loss and when you're talking about not fitting in and that developmental stage of finding yourself being especially challenged by these kinds of moves, it sounds like a trauma experience in some ways. Is that too strong of a term to use?
Well, it's a good point. I would probably say that in some young people, it can be a wonderful asset. And as Ruth had touched on, there are some wonderful things that can come from that cross-cultural experience, to include a worldview, cultural tolerance, languages, adaptability. And for others, it can be that profound sense of loss and grief that sometimes we don't know for a very long time that can be uncovered. And certainly from my own interest in working with teenagers, can be this issue of identity and belonging, and you could add on to that trauma. And I will just say that being being an adolescent can be difficult enough because it's a time where you're thinking about your physical identity, you're thinking about your sexual and gender identity, and you throw onto that your cultural identity. And you hope that at some point during your teen years, you have resolution of all those forms of identity, and that you're very clear about yourself as you become an adult. But any kind of questioning about that can sometimes be more challenging. And I think, again, this concept of potentially a trauma could be something that you can envision in some young people. And certainly, again, for our audience, folks that are working with young people, it's something we have to be very aware of and continue to ask more about.
Becky, I'll start with you and kind of go back. The main characteristics, what are some of the positive and negative attributes of being a TCK? If you could, I mean, I know you're talking with a lot of parents that have this profile, whose children are this profile, and some that aren't. So you might be in a great position to kind of talk and contrast with the positives and negatives of being a TCK.
Yeah, I think most parents, when they get that overseas assignment, they're really excited because of the chance to live in another country, culture, travel, adventure. I think that most parents see it as it's going to be something that's going to be a net positive for their children. And so they're really excited about it, and they're excited for the entire family. I think that there are a lot of positive attributes to TCKs, and those are their strengths. And I think those are some of the things that can lead to their resilience. Most kids that I've met, I'm going to say most because there's always an exception to everything. Sure. And I just want to add, if we're talking about kids who might be a little atypical, they're going to have a different experience moving around the world and adapting with change. So I just wanted to make sure I made that point. But some of the positive attributes, I would say that TCKs in general tend to have a three-dimensional view of the world. They tend to like diversity. They tend to be adaptable and flexible, but not all. I think that they find it's easy to make friends when they move overseas, but not always. Depends on where you move and the circumstances. And I think most of them really enjoy the travel and the adventure. I think some of the downside is that when it's over and you go back to your country of passport, that not that many people are going to really understand and be able to relate to your experiences. So there's a lot that you suppress. You don't talk about it. Like I said, the short answer or the long answer, because people will think that maybe you're putting on airs if you talk about how you just sat at dawn and had your family photo taken in front of the Taj Mahal. Like they think you're just making that up or you're just bragging, when really that was your reality. Right. I think also, as we talked about, the loss of everything that was familiar to you, the airplane go up. I think also that there's a feeling of restlessness a lot of times and rootlessness among some of our TCKs. It's funny, even within the same family, you might have one child who says, I'm going to go and live in a place with the white picket fence. And then the next child is going to say that would be just a sentence for me. I can't wait to get back out there and travel again. So you don't know how different people within the same family even are going to react to that. But I do think that because, especially if we're talking about something like diplomatic service, where you're on the move every 2 or 3 years and you just kind of expect that, a lot of times kids get used to that rapid sequence of change. I think another downside is that sometimes when the going gets tough, they want to check out or move. And so not really resolving problems is something that I have seen, especially the TCKs that I work with in the therapeutic process, because if you're in a situation where there's a problem, either you hope they get on a plane or you're going to get on a plane, but you can resolve the problem by just walking away and leaving it. And so I think sometimes when they come back and they're in a situation where they can't move on, then sometimes they don't really have the problem-solving skills that they need. Right. And then the last thing I would say is that with transition requires emotional energy. And so when they're diverting their emotional energy into coping with the transition, sometimes that's energy that's diverted from another developmental task that they need to attend to. So even the most resilient kids are going to have to expend energy in order to make that transition.
Gotcha. Ruth or Dr. Anisha, do you have anything to add to that before I move on to the next question?
Well, I would agree with the positives, and I would say that sometimes the very positives are what kept me, at least, from looking at what were the stresses of my life.
Wow.
And so I didn't understand how I could have depression or kind of a lot of anger that I didn't understand, because until I was 39, I hadn't looked at my losses. And so it was coming out, losses will come out, losses create grief. And the more you've loved something, the more grief you have. And so I tell parents that if your child is experiencing grief, it's not because you did something bad. It's because you gave them a great gift. And I happen to love living in Nigeria. So because I never knew how to process it, there was no funeral when we left because nobody died. And so there was no way that I knew at that point to process it. And so I lived with it pushed on the side, but it was coming out every so often in this depression that other people didn't see, or in anger, or different things like that. And that's what I think can be the challenge, is that we have symptoms that we don't understand and we don't know why. And people go to therapists who don't understand either, because it's an invisible world. So that's where, like I say, if people can understand the story and normalize the process, that if you've had all these separations, you're going to have loss. It's normal, even if it's good. And how do we process this? How can parents help them process it as they're doing it, as life is going on, which is why Anisha and Rebecca both have a major interest in doing transition programs, so that you can take care of it when it happens and you don't have to be 39 and figuring it out. So that's my biggest thing to parents is if the child is feeling sad to leave, it's because they liked what they were doing, but also helping the child to process that at the time, and the whole family, so that you can deal with it and go on and really gain and live well from these wonderful gifts you have. I certainly am glad this was my story, but it, had this place I had to figure out what was going on.
Right.
I was just going to add that kids can have very different experiences. We just recently moved from Europe back to the United States, and I have two boys. One seemed to adapt very easily to coming back to the United States. Didn't seem to be an issue at all. My younger one continued to be angry about the move for a very long time and questioned why we had to leave the last country. So within one family, I think you can have very different experiences. So as much as, again, parents, adults, caregivers can be proactive in terms of realizing that these issues are real, that we need to be aware, we need to start to think about these transitions and how young people are experiencing them, and then continue to check in. And sometimes these processes can be delayed in terms of reactions that may not happen immediately after that transition. It may come, months and years after. So just being aware of that and continuing to kind of ask those questions, I think, is so helpful.
I'm going a little bit off our script. Becky, you want to say something?
I would just add that I think there's also a little bit of guilt sometimes at feeling bad, because we've had so much privilege. And so how can you possibly complain when you look at what you've been able to do? And so there's a little bit of that guilt about saying that there was something that wasn't exactly perfect in your life.
Right. I'm going to go a little bit off script and ask a question that's just coming up for me as you guys are teaching. It's might be the same answer, might be a different answer. What are the biggest mistakes you see parents make and or treatment professionals make when dealing with TCKs? I'll start with Dr. Abraham. I'll start there.
Well, I would just say it's a lack of awareness. And certainly as a pediatrician, I would argue that many physicians don't even think about this as an issue. They may realize that someone's had a move or a change or a transition, but I don't think that many providers spend enough time delving into this. And a lot of my work is actually just encouraging other physicians to start to think about, where is this young person from? Who else is at home? What other languages are being spoken? What other religions are there? Many times we assume, particularly if they are speaking the same language, that they're assimilated and they're from the same place. But there's so many layers that sometimes we need to peel back and understand. So starting to ask more of those questions. And many times I think our patients will, as Becky mentioned, if they can connect with you, they actually sometimes will really enjoy having that conversation and feel good about sharing. And it's another form of a connection. So I would probably say that most of us as providers don't spend enough time even delving into this to begin with.
Gotcha. Ruth, what do you have to add to the common mistakes you see parents or professionals make?
I see them all the time.
Yeah.
Exactly what Anisha said. It's the lack of awareness, but part of the lack of awareness is what were the losses. And so it's not just that somebody died. It's that I lost my status. I knew who I was in Nigeria. I had friends, but I also knew how life worked. And so all of a sudden I lost the way my life was supposed to be. I lost friends. I lost the sights and smells and all these things that were home. But nobody would think of that as home for me. So they just think I'm glad to be back in the States. So there's a whole host of things we list in our book about what are some of the hidden losses. So first there's lack of awareness. Then there's also lack of permission. The very effort to encourage, or when somebody goes to a therapist, exactly what Becky said, look at all the good you had. Okay,
Right.
good. I had good. And I did. That's the problem. I did have good. So how come I feel so bad?
Nice.
And so, we had to do this. We're putting you through college. And so, okay, it's a life of privilege. So you're caught. There's no permission to say it was hard. But we also have lack of time. Grief takes time. And so we take these airplane rides and there's no process. When I was a child, we took at least boat rides. And my parents did that because they liked 10 days in between intuitively. My father was a TCK. He probably didn't know any language about it, but we don't have time. And so you get to the other place and everybody's doing that. And that's I got a whole bunch of stories I could tell you about that, but no time here. But so we don't have time. But the other big thing is lack of comfort. People don't listen. They try and talk them out of the pain. And encouragement is different than comfort. And so if somebody could just comfort them, I went to boarding school at 6. When I was 39, I'm trying to figure out that piece of my story. And I realized nobody ever said to me, it's okay to miss your mommy. You're 6 years old. She's 300 miles away. Everybody tried to talk to me about all the fun things we were going to do. And, everybody thinks that it's going to be, you don't want to see the kid cry. Parents don't want to see the kid cry. So we try to push ourselves into it. So the lack of comfort, if people could just stop and listen and ask the kid, like Anisha said, so how was it for you? What are you missing? What do you miss most? In time, they will process it. I had a daughter who didn't want to put her belt on when we left Liberia, the seatbelt in the plane. And so, she cried and I felt terrible, all the things Becky's saying. But a year later, we were talking one day and I thought she had adjusted fine. She said, I really miss Liberia. And I wanted to tell her how well she was doing. I thought, okay, wait a minute. So, well, how do you feel about being here? She said, I really miss it there and I really like it here. And I thought, that's the point. This is a life of paradox, of incredible paradox. And we have to let us live in the paradox, that we can love it and we can miss it.
Beautiful. Becky?
Yeah, well, I'll speak from personal experience because I raised 3 kids in this lifestyle. And I wish I had read Ruth's book before when they were still teenagers instead of at the point when I did. I have it here on my bookshelf. I can show you how dog-eared it is and how many pages I highlighted. Because when I read the book for the first time, I thought, and I didn't know Ruth yet, I just said, oh my gosh, how did they get into my household? They were here the whole time watching this and writing everything down. It was so true to our own family's experience. And my children have been very generous with their feedback and what I could have done better and differently, their father as well. And one of the things that I think that is really is something that I wish I had done better was to provide comfort before being the cheerleader. And that's something, Ruth, you just talked about. But I think that even though I might have had my own loss and grief every time we moved, and I might have been, in my room with my own tears, when I emerged, I wanted to be the strong, happy one. Like, isn't this great? Let's figure out where we can go and do horseback riding lessons on the beach. And I should have spent more time just listening and validating and comforting and empathizing and listening instead of cheerleading.
Right.
That's what I wish I had done differently. And the second thing I think that happens during transition, especially, is that whether you're arriving or leaving, life is chaotic. And you're packing, you've got either your welcomes or you've got the farewells. Sometimes there's sudden departures because of COVID or terrorism or some natural disaster. But the times when the family is transitioning is the time when the parents are the most distracted.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when the kids need you the most. And so I think that if I could say one thing that I see in other families is, again, just trying as much as you possibly can to be present for your children during, and even teens, during these moments of transition, the family dinner time, the family dinner table, letting them process at the end of the day. You wouldn't believe what happened today. Let them talk about it.
Right. I'm going to make a comment. Like I said, although this is a very specific topic, I always like to talk about how it blends or lends itself to others. And when you're all mentioning grief so often, one of the things that we learn about doing therapy, grief therapy with people, is the greatest challenge often is that two people in the same family are experiencing grief in a different way.
Yes.
And so you need somebody external, because if you're talking to your mother, your father, your brother or sister, they're having their own relationship, their own experience of grief, and it's hard to be there for somebody's unique experience. And so part of what I'm hearing from you guys is a very shared, but also at the same time individual experience. And it's hard to be there for somebody else's experiencing when you're having your own profound experience at the same time. Becky, I feel so ignorant about this subject that I actually want you to ask questions in a way, kind of pick what I really want to say to you, like, what are the most important questions that I or therapists or parents should be asking you experts about TCKs?
Who wants to go first?
Well, I was saying about, teaching professionals, even some questions asked. Once somebody's aware of the topic, I'm telling you that my husband always says, how do you meet all these people? I said, when I say, hi, where are you from? And they can't answer, they give me an evasive answer. I said, I know I have one, because it's so almost clinical. Or if it's on the paper and the people are from someplace else, there are questions to ask. But you guys are working in the families professionally. What kind of questions you ask them?
That's a great question.
I once worked with a therapist on a case of a TCK who had been through multiple transitions, and then there was family divorce and trauma, and there was just all kinds of stuff. And this young woman, the teenage girl, ended up in a wilderness setting, and she was not going to share. She didn't share with her community therapist. Arms crossed, mouth closed. You're not going to get it out of me no matter what you do. And so she got to wilderness, and she was, again, that was her stance. I am not going to share. So he found a roundabout way of asking her some of the questions. And he would say, tell me a story. Just tell me a story. I want to hear about where, a story about where she's been. And then it got her to tell a story. It didn't have to be her story. It could be a story. And then he got her talking. And then he said, what do you miss? Tell me something you miss. And that also got her to open up and talk a little bit more.
Very cool.
I would just add, coming back to the discussion of stories, the importance of also asking young people what their personal story is. And I know, Ruth, you talk about this a lot in your book, and certainly in my own. I say that we all as adults have our own story. My dad came from South India on a Spanish cargo ship in the 60s, and he has his own story. Each of us have our stories, and if we don't share them, sometimes they kind of keep inside, they can fester, they can cause other issues. Being able to share that story is such a wonderful and therapeutic thing. And so again, encouraging adults to share stories within families, but certainly as a provider, also asking young people if they're comfortable to start start to share that story as a way to have that, again, as a common experience, and get them to start to be able to, again, connect and maybe evolve in terms of how they're feeling.
And I want to say that Anisha's book is a wonderful book. I wish I'd read it when I had teens, or I gave it to my daughter who has teens and has an international group of kids because she has international adoptees, but it's a great book. But one other thing I would think, if you just think, somebody brought her child to me a few months ago, and they come from another country. Child was trying to go to school here, didn't want to go to school. Always liked to go to school before. So when there's a change, just start thinking. So I just asked the girl, I said, how do they do math where you are? And she looked at me, she said, they do it backwards. Mm. If you understand that other cultures have different ways they do math, they have other ways they do science. I mean, just simple things. But for that child, she thought she liked school before, but now she said, I went to chemistry class. I've never used beakers. I've never used all these things. All these other kids know how to do it. So when she goes to school, she's suddenly feeling stupid. And the people, because she is of American, white American heritage, going to a private school, nobody notices or thinks that she would have had a totally different experience in her educational process. And so her behavior's changed. She's looking grouchy. They've taken her to a bunch of therapists already to see why she's so depressed. And I think, well, she's depressed because she doesn't know how to do her schoolwork. I mean, it's something that kind of basic sometimes. Just ask the question.
I want to ask a couple of the questions that we've talked about before we started. I want to ask the question, suggestions that you have for creating belonging and connectedness with TCK children. What do any of you have for suggestions about creating that sense of belonging and connectedness to others? Becky, do you want to start again, and we'll just kind of go around again in a circle?
Sure. I think if kids can have some kind of what Dr. Robert Brooks calls islands of competence, things that they're good at, that they can take with them from place to place, that is certainly helpful. But that doesn't always work. So it could be that overseas, you're a star on the baseball team, and then you come back to the States thinking you're going to play. And by the time you arrive and go to tryouts, the team has already been picked the season before, and you don't stand a chance. So I say everything with a caveat, but to try to find things that will be portable skills and interests and talents so that you can plug in wherever you go and find a community. I think that's helpful. I think the importance of school and fit is critical as well. So it could be that if you're moving overseas, the school that everybody goes to might not be the best school for your child or all of your children, maybe some, but not all of your children. So finding the school, as Ruth was just talking about, where you don't know how to do the math, but imagine if you had a learning disability, how that would make your move so much more difficult and so much more frustrating if you also had to deal with the frustration of school. Sometimes a boarding school, to be able to minimize the disruption and the transitions that you have to go through to get through high school, that might be a really good solution as well, to minimize some of the disruption of these transitions and to foster resiliency. And then the other thing, Dr. Robert Brooks is a psychologist out of Boston who has become a mentor and a friend of mine. And I really appreciated a lot of the advice that he's given along the way. And that is that they have found that children who have gone through adverse child experiences, who are the most resilient, are those who had the present charismatic adult in their life. And so who is that charismatic adult? It's usually somebody who's not the parent. So whether that be through a school group, a church group, trusted family friend, a therapist, somebody who can be that sounding board outside of the family that can be a positive influence in the life of that child, can sometimes really be extremely helpful and supportive.
Ruth, how about you? Ways of creating belonging and connectedness with TCKs?
Well, I think first to normalize the experience. a lot of problems for a lot of kids is thinking, what's wrong with me? Why don't I fit? How come I don't belong, etc. So I think when kids understand their story, and the parents can understand it, that's helpful. But then also there's, especially with online now, there's a lot of people who have a shared experience. It doesn't mean you can only relate to people of shared experience. Like you said, grief is a universal. If I understand my story of grief, I can understand somebody else's. So that's another huge thing, is realizing being a third culture kid is your experience. It's not your identity. It's something that, how you lived, and other people live different ways. They have shared experiences of loss, grief, whatever. But in a specific way, like right now, there's a Tcks of Asia. They've started their podcast, and they're taking this to a whole nother level of things that I never knew about, but the issues of language. What they went to school in one language, they came home in a different language, what that did for them and their sense of identity. And so I'm listening to them and I think, wow, I'm learning a lot, but they're listening to each other and they're finding out, I thought I was the only one. And so when you start to have these conversations, and they're on the web all over the place, but I'm just fascinated. It's kind of like at the beginning when I didn't know I was a TCK, and you find out, oh, there's this group that's called this thing that I belong to. And now there's a whole exploration of these other nuances, and the world is exploding with awareness, I think, of what is this story, and normalizing it and finding other people you can talk about it with, and you're not crazy, and you almost don't even have to explain yourself because they get it. And so I think, and also if people can find mentors, if you can, when you move to a new place, you can find a family where they've got kids your kid's age or something, because too often the kids who feel estranged may wind up with the other kids that are kind of fringe kids because they don't know anybody else who will take them in. And so if you can find mentors, that's good, but also just normalizing and finding people who listen to your story so that you know that you're not crazy. I think then we can use who we are again. Anisha, you've got a whole bunch of good stuff I've heard you talk about before.
Well, I think we've had some wonderful suggestions, and maybe just to add to that, a lot of what I do in my work, and certainly what we are more and more thinking about in the pediatric world, is using a strength-based approach in terms of working with young people. And the idea that when you do ask a young person what they think their strength is, or what their special skill, their super skill is, it's a wonderful way to start a discussion, even if there's a lot of other high-risk behaviors that are occurring, and trying to come back and do motivational counseling based on what that strength may be. And every child has a strength, whether or not they can connect, or they're good at the arts or music, or they have some particular dream or goal that they have in their life. And I think that's a wonderful way, as Becky mentioned, to build on these strengths as ways to build on self-esteem, which is so important for many of these kids that are grappling with all of these different issues, particularly in the teen years. And so again, building on those strengths, I think, is one piece that's very useful. The other part is knowing that as a family, as a parent, that you're not alone. I'm a huge believer in what I call using the global village and connecting. So whether that means reaching out, as Ruth mentioned, to a mentor, to a teacher, to a coach, or much less a counselor or someone that's a health provider. And again, many of them are offering virtual sessions right now, so you don't have to physically go. In my own case, when we first moved back, using my family and putting them just on Zoom and saying, look, I have a child that's really angry. Can you talk to them? Because I'm really busy with all these other things. And over time, it was neighbors. And very recently, we've bought a pandemic puppy who has been fabulous with helping our kids with some of the transition and changes. So thinking about, again, those global connections. The other piece I just wanted to mention is that also thinking and really kind of coming back and embracing those rituals and customs that are part of one's home as you're experiencing all these cultures is so important. And I will say that because we've lived in 3 different countries over the last 10 years. And so our holidays now are just a big mix of all of those countries, plus, the countries that my husband and I are from, whether it's the food or what, you see on the table or any of those things, and continuing to have that wonderful mix. And also just to continue to encourage kids to have those language skills that they may have picked up as a wonderful way to continue to connect with their home culture or the new culture, I think, are other pieces to create those connections. But there's so much that we can do. Being open and aware and starting to think about this with families, I think, is really important.
You actually
I can add
started on
one
my next
thing.
question, which was building resilience. Ruth, were you saying something?
No, I was just going to add to what Anisha said or affirm it. I always tell parents, build portable traditions for your family, because if you talk about belonging, where's the one place? Most TCKs, if you say, where do you belong? They relate it to relationships, not to a place. And wherever my mom and dad are. And so families are important around the world, no matter what your story is, key. But in this kind of a lifestyle, it's really important. And if parents know they're going to be moving, you build those traditions that no matter where you go, this is us. This is how our family does it. That's what Anisha was saying. But I just wanted to underscore that, because I think that is really what parents need to understand, is you're building a place of belonging for your children in a way that is even more than it would be in any other, more settled place. So thank you, Anisha.
I want to give, thank you, Ruth. I want to give the audience a chance. We have one question that has come up, and I want to give the audience, just remind you, you can send in any questions you have about TCKs, and I'll pass them on to our panel. But you're reminding me, before I get into those last couple of questions from the audience, you're reminding me, I remember young and very early in my career, where parents decided at one point for a couple of years to take their child around the world in a boat, a pretty small boat, actually. And I remember being in my 30s thinking, wouldn't that be amazing? And of course, the kid was not happy about it at all. And I could see what you guys are describing, where the parents were wanting to focus on the diversity and the cultural exposure and the wonderful education, that would be such a unique experience. But the kid was sitting there saying, I just wanted to have a normal life. And I remember very early being confronted with the reality that the best of intentions or the best of ideas, that everybody's going to interpret, experience, digest it just a little bit different. And you're all reminding me of that, because I love the idea of moving around a lot, but that might not be the best fit for any child or any particular child. Somebody asked this question. Somebody said, how does Evoke or other wilderness therapy programs? Becky, I'm probably going to focus on you and me with this, but Anisha and Ruth, you can chime in also. How does Evoke or other wilderness therapy programs support the TCK child and their families? Often there's a language and a cultural gap that exists in the therapeutic process for both the child and the parents. So Becky, because you have a more a macro view of things compared to me, I work in my program, and I can talk about what we do, what I do, and I'll just publicize the fact that we're doing this today to help. But this is 22 years into my career as a wilderness therapist. What are the things that you suggest that we all do in the therapeutic field to help TCK families?
Well, especially because some of the TCKs you have may not be American. They could be from other international families where they have somehow found their way into, they've had a mental health issue and this is the treatment plan. I think, first of all, respect for the fact that different families are going to have different, a cultural lens through which they're going to see everything and hear everything that happens in the family work in a program.
Mm-hmm.
So I think pairing the child with a therapist who has a lot of awareness around other cultures, curiosity. The best therapists I've worked with have been therapists who have been extremely curious to learn more about the family of origin and to respect their family of origin traditions and the way they may look at things, and yet still be able to look at that family of origin and say, and I'm going to give you some universal truths. These are some of the things that are not working and will not work. Mm-hmm. I had that conversation with someone earlier today. Like, the ultra permissiveness with unlimited money is not a good look, no matter what your culture. But communicating that idea across cultures is a challenge. So yeah, I would just say, first of all, having the openness, the awareness, the curiosity, respect, to listen to the family, to try to meet them where they are, and to still be true to what it is that you're trying to communicate in the work that you're trying to do through the program.
Thank you. I'll give you my answer, and Ruth and Anisha, if you want to add after I answer. Again, they're asking specifically about our approach, but we work through and think through an attachment-based lens. And what attachment-informed therapy tells us is that no two people have the same experience. There's a saying in attachment theory that says no two children have the same parent. And so what I would say is the same experience that I've learned with dealing with diverse clients, not necessarily third culture kids, but diverse clients, is I may have lost my father and you may have lost your father, but we don't necessarily have the same experience of grief or loss. So it's about, like you said, Becky, for me, listening. I'm constantly teaching the therapists to listen. It's not that I want the person to educate the therapist about third culture kids and the issues, but I want the therapist to listen to that child's experience of it and to listen very, very deeply and to have a not knowing, a beginner's mind with each individual case. I remember I wanted to tell this one story and ask if you guys have any reaction to this. I was dealing with a third culture kid family. I was dealing with the parents in a parent coaching context. And I found myself in the second or third session apologizing that I might be presenting issues that were contrary to the dominant culture where they grew up. I was saying, I know I'm presenting ideas, like you said, Becky, that there are ideas that are universal, that we think are true of all human beings. But I was presenting things, psychologically speaking, that I thought could be in conflict with the way that their culture taught or what their culture was based on. And I paused after apologizing about the 15th time. And I said, to be honest with you, my next door neighbor wouldn't understand what I'm talking about, because some of these issues are new, like the experience that you guys shared with being able to listen to a child's pain and not rush in to try to tell them to look on the bright side. That's a universal attachment experience that, regardless of your cultural background, regardless of your culture, we know that has an impact on the child when they can be heard, when their experience can be validated and held with compassion and understanding. So I don't know if you guys have any reaction to that. Like, Brad, you did the exact wrong thing. But I just had this experience that, yes, there was something unique. They were from the Middle East. There was something unique about their culture that I was definitely asking them to understand or to adapt to what was going on with their child and his addiction. And at the same time, my neighbors across the street who were raised, who grew up in the same neighborhood as me their entire life, would find the same ideas that I was presenting as challenging to their culture as anybody from another country. So was I insane, or was I partially true, or was I right on?
Anisha, you might have more cultural. The one thing that I would say is, one thing I am learning throughout my life is we all have a lens through which we interpret what's right and what's wrong.
Right.
And we know that, but our lenses are always so strong that we can't quite, we can't really believe we're not seeing it right. And so one of the things, and I really do want Anisha to talk about, when Danao Tanu, who did her PhD in Asian TCKs and it heads up this TCKs of Asia group, she met me in Singapore like 10 years ago. And she said, you guys say you have such a broad cultural view and, you know, you're all so wonderful. But she said, nobody knew who I was when I went home at night, because at school I had to be Western in order to fit in. And I started to hate myself that I was Asian because, you know, but everybody at school would think, oh, she's fitting in fine. But she said, the minute I went home, I had to be somebody else, and nobody asked me about that part of me. And so that's part of the, you know, the culture, the things that are coming up that I'm learning. So Anisha, you're way more the expert here. What do you say?
Brad, I don't know if there's a perfect answer. I just think the short the humility to realize that there are other approaches, and certainly to ask, what might be those other approaches, and certainly what might be barriers. I can just say from my time living in Hong Kong, even getting mental health for certain communities, there's a lot of stigma attached to it. And certainly as someone that's from, India, again, there's a lot of stigma attached to going to someone outside of the family to get help, and being aware of that. And instead of saying, why is it that you're not going to anyone? Why is there so much pressure? Being aware of that fact, or asking them, what are some of those barriers, perhaps from a cultural standpoint, I think creates awareness, certainly again, creates that connection between you and your patient, and allows you to have much more of a therapeutic relationship. So openness, questioning, awareness, I think is always the best route when we have those differences.
I love it. We're up against the hour, so I really I want to open it up to each one of you to give your kind of closing thought or nugget. And then also I'll click on, for those that are watching either live or on our YouTube channel, I'll click on your bio again. So your take home nugget, and then your resources, where to find you, your book, your work. And I'll start with you. I'm going to go backwards. I'll go Becky, Anisha, and Ruth. I'll go in that order. So Becky, I'll start with you, and then we'll go backwards.
Okay. Well, first of all, you might have a slide to our website, because there we go. We have a whole assembly of resources on our website for TCKs, and you'll be able to find a link to Ruth's book and Anisha's book there. Another really great books. There's another book that was written by Lois Bouchang on counseling the globally nomad. I forgot the name of the book, but it's there.
Belonging Everywhere and Nowhere.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. So first of all, yeah.
And the website for those listening is rnginternational.com.
Right. And if you go over to resources, there's a drop-down menu, and just click on Third Culture Kids. And that's where I put everything that I had in one place, and I update it periodically. So the other thing, what nugget would I leave people with? Can I go last?
Yes. You kind of helped me set this up, so you have privileges.
Okay.
So Anisha, would you be willing to go first?
Absolutely. So I was just going to say, I wrote my book, Raising Global Teens, because I wanted to start conversations between young people and parents, educators, and caregivers. And I think that conversations create connections, and connections are so protective, particularly now during the COVID pandemic, but even more so for young people that are going through all these changes with mobility and transition. And the book really goes through all the hot topics that, again, young people are experiencing, based on questions that both teenagers and parents have had. So again, if anyone is interested, I can be reached at dranishaAbraham.com. I write a monthly newsletter about global teen issues. I'm on Instagram and on LinkedIn as well. But certainly would encourage anyone that's listening to make sure that they're having that important conversation with their child or teenager in their life, or that they're working with, and starting to create those connections, particularly as we think about culture and all the wonderful things that come with it.
Thank you, Dr. Abraham. Ruth?
Never forget they're still kids. Sometimes we get the experience so much in the forefront, we forget they're still kids, and that the same things that every kid needs, they need. And that certainly is one of the things Anisha's book really emphasizes. And love them well, listen well, and know that most of us who grew up this way wouldn't trade it in the end for anything. It's been a rich life. I would never have wanted to grow any other way. It's formed my life and taught me lots of cross-cultural skills that, you just learn from living, that other people you don't even know you're doing that. But don't be in a panic. The reason I do what I do is because I want to help people do it well, so that the kids can move ahead. And my website's not on there, but it's crossculturalkid.org.
Great.
And you can reach me there, or I'm on Facebook and all that rest of that stuff too. But anyway, enjoy them, enjoy the experience, and remember they're still kids.
Becky?
I love them.
Thanks, Ruth.
I think once I'm at a loss for words. How would I sum it up? I'm just really glad that you gave us the opportunity to talk about this, Brad. I think this is something that we feel, I know Anisha and Ruth and I all feel very passionate about. This has been an important part of our life's work. I think we feel almost the zeal of a missionary to share our experiences with TCKs in a way to help people understand this unique experience of not only the kids, but their families. And it's, yes, there are some pitfalls, but overall, I think that I'm personally grateful that we had the opportunity within our family to have some of these experiences. And I feel incredibly grateful that I'm able to share this through my professional life as well.
Well, thank you very much. I'm very honored and grateful that you would join us. And I will absolutely just echo what somebody else just wrote. Somebody said, as a parent of a TCK, I found this rich and informative. Thank you very much. So I want to thank you, Ruth and Anisha and Becky, for joining us. Thanks for offering us your experience and your wisdom. And we just really appreciate you being a part of this. And again, for the people that are looking for resources and books and information, we hope that they can find your sites informative and helpful for them, because I know, thinking about things from an attachment lens, from the parent perspective, doing it alone is really, really hard. And what I love about attachment work and attachment research is it's international. You know, the work that we do, that we learn about, that informs the attachment informed therapy that I do, it's not United States based at all, but it's all over the world. And the principles of listening and being a adequate container for your child. And Ruth, what you just said really rang to me, that you wouldn't trade it for anything, but you had to go through your own process. And that, for me, gives hope to parents who are afraid when their child is going through the rough grief parts, going through the difficult parts, to know that they can make their way through the process, and the parents need support along the way as the child kind of struggles through that. So thank you all. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah.
Been
Have a good evening.
privileged to be here.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
you too.
Okay.
All right, everybody. Good night. I'll talk to
Thank
you
you.
next time.
Good night.
Okay.
Good night.
Bye.